I was referred here by my sister because she thought it might be helpful to get opinions from people who aren't familiar with my situation. I'm a 31-year-old woman, and you can call me Sophia. My husband, Henry, is 33 years old. We've been married for 10 years and together for nearly 13. We have 2 children, a 9-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Before my affair, Henry was the only man I had been with, while he had 3 previous girlfriends before dating me. Our marriage was wonderful, filled with love, laughter, and a blessed family. Despite being married for several years, our intimacy was completely satisfying for me, and I believe Henry felt the same way. Now, here's where I messed everything up. I met a man, let's call him Adam, at my daughter's soccer practice. He was a parent of a 6-year-old girl who played in the league below my daughter's. He had the flexibility to work from home, allowing him to attend soccer practice and games. Initially, I spoke to him as part of a group of parents while watching our children from the sidelines. These conversations eventually led to an uncomfortable one where he confessed his strong feelings for me. I made it clear that I was happily married and that we needed to stop talking. He respected my boundaries and backed off. Even though I rejected his advances, I have to admit that I enjoyed the attention for some reason. Looking back, I know it was wrong, but I want to be honest about my feelings at the time. Eventually, he brought up his feelings again and asked if we could meet for coffee at a cafe in the next town over. Initially, I declined, but later I changed my mind and agreed to meet him, with a clear understanding that it would be a one-time coffee meeting and nothing more. I now realize that just talking to him amounted to cheating and a complete lack of respect for my husband and family. However, I found it hard to stop. At the end of our private meeting, just before we headed to our children's practice, he asked me to come to his house the next day at the same time. He handed me a piece of paper with his home address. Initially, I said, "No, I can't." But then he gently kissed me. I'm ashamed to admit that not only did I kiss him back, but I also kissed him again when he pulled away. The following day, we met at his house and it happened. There was no conversation or build-up. We simply went through with it. As I glanced around and saw pictures of his beautiful wife and child, I became deeply upset with myself. Thoughts of Henry and our kids flooded my mind, and I burst into tears, telling Adam that I couldn't do this again. We cleaned up, got dressed, and left separately in our cars for practice. For the next week, I avoided Adam at soccer practice, and when I finally spoke to him again, I made it clear that I wanted nothing to do with him, ever. In response, he handed me a note with the name and address of a hotel in the neighboring town. He mentioned that he wanted me to meet him there the next day at our usual time, but understood if I chose not to. I simply responded to him with a firm, "No, I can't," and left. That night, I stayed up, consumed by thoughts about the situation and how it could shatter my marriage and family if it ever came to light. I foolishly believed that it was unlikely since we never communicated through calls or texts. All our interactions were verbal or through handwritten notes. Initially, I had no intention of going, but eventually I broke down and gave in. Just like our first encounter, it ended with tears, and I told Adam that we couldn't continue this. This time, he concurred, but he added that he believed our intimacy was worth the risk. We went our separate ways, and this time we remained apart for a whole month, with no contact except for brief conversations at soccer practice and during games while talking to other parents. What's most unsettling is that during one of the games, my husband Henry and Adam ended up having a lengthy conversation, lasting over 20 minutes. It left me feeling terrible, but at the same time, it strangely excited me in a twisted way. Fast forward to my D-Day, the day my husband discovered my affair, which turned out to be the worst day of my life. Adam and I had a conversation at soccer practice the day before and agreed that we could no longer meet since we were both happily married and loved our spouses and children. However, here's where I made a terrible mistake. We decided to meet one final time. I know some of you may find it hard to believe, but it's the truth. D-Day was meant to be our last encounter. I didn't want to meet at Adam's house because I couldn't bear to see the photos of his wife and child. Instead, I suggested he come to my home. The plan was for him to park on the adjacent street and walk over to my house. Then he would come to the side door and I would let him in. It was lightly raining and there was no one on the street, so I believed he did so without being noticed. I took him to our home office on the second floor, which has a guest bed, and that's where we met. I want to make it clear that I would never engage in anything like this in our marital bed, as I have too much love and respect for my husband. Since this was supposed to be our final encounter, there was a lot of hugging and kissing. Just before things escalated further, just as we started, my husband Henry entered the room and stood beside the bed, recording the whole scene. I have no idea how long he had been there before he exclaimed, "What the hell is going on here?" In response, Adam and I quickly jumped up and separated. I burst into tears, apologizing to Henry and saying that I could explain everything. Although I didn't know what exactly to explain, but it was the only thing that came to mind at the time. I'm not sure what came over Adam, but he went into a complete panic and tried to rush past Henry, who was blocking the door. Henry, who stands over 6 feet tall and weighs nearly 230 pounds, blocked his way, and Adam, who is about 5 feet 10 inches and weighs around 160 pounds, bounced off Henry and fell back to the floor. He got back up and attempted to charge at Henry again, but this time, Henry stepped forward and forcefully pushed him back. The push sent Adam flying backward, and he collided with one of the window screens before falling out of the window and landing on a large bush in front of our house. He was completely naked. I cried and pleaded with Henry to stop, fearing that he would harm Adam, and I didn't want Henry to get into legal trouble. But Henry gave me a stern look and rushed downstairs. I was afraid he was going to physically harm Adam, and I worried about the consequences for my husband with the law. I watched from the window, wrapped in a blanket, and saw Adam still lying in the bush, trying to extricate himself. I could see that he had scratches and injuries, but nothing too severe. Henry emerged from the house holding Adam's cell phone and began yelling at Adam, demanding his passcode. Adam begged for mercy, urging Henry not to hurt him and not to contact his wife, Kate. Henry grew angrier and told Adam, "Give me the darn code or you'll face the consequences." Adam quickly provided the code, and Henry entered it into the phone. Henry then called Kate and identified himself, explaining that he was standing there with her husband, who was naked, and that he had caught him in a compromising situation with his wife. After some further conversation and words of comfort, Henry gave Kate our address and ended the call. That's when I noticed our next-door neighbor heading our way and inquiring if everything was okay. Henry assured our neighbor that he was okay and expressed gratitude for him calling. He went on to explain that he had caught us in the act. Our neighbor mentioned that he had suspected something was amiss when he saw a man sneaking around outside our house. Initially, he thought it might be a burglar until he witnessed me opening the door and allowing the man inside. Our neighbor conveyed to Henry that he felt compelled to make the call. Upon hearing this, Henry informed the neighbor that he intended to contact the police to report the situation. Adam, who was still undressed and trembling violently at this point, began to cry and implored Henry not to involve the authorities. I yelled down to Henry, asking him to reconsider calling the police, but he disregarded our pleas and made the call. The police arrived within a few minutes. Henry and our neighbor met the officer at the curb, where they conversed for several minutes. They pointed towards our neighbor's house and then gestured towards the office window. Subsequently, they approached the bush where Adam was huddled, sobbing. The officer inquired whether Henry could retrieve Adam's clothes, and Henry agreed. As I heard Henry open the door, I rushed to the top of the stairs, tearfully expressing my remorse and love for him. However, he didn't look up or acknowledge me. He merely collected Adam's clothing and shoes from the floor and stairs before returning outside. The officer accepted the clothes from Henry and handed them to Adam, who awkwardly dressed himself. It was a profoundly embarrassing sight. At this point, Adam was experiencing hyperventilation and still shaking uncontrollably. I had never witnessed someone in such a state before and realized it was likely due to a combination of nervous fear, shock, and the chilly 55-degree weather. I positioned myself by the window as the officer began questioning Adam, although they couldn't see me due to the window screens we had. The officer advised Adam to calm down and relax, which he eventually managed to do. Adam took responsibility for the situation, expressing that it was entirely his fault. He truthfully recounted what had occurred, and explained that he had charged at Henry because he simply wanted to get away from there. When asked by the officer whether Henry had acted defensively or aggressively when he pushed him, Adam clarified that it had been a defensive action. I felt relieved that Adam didn't falsely accuse Henry. Soon, a group of neighbors had gathered out front. The neighbor who had alerted Henry was explaining the situation to them. I felt immensely embarrassed and continued to cry. Now, turning back to the police officer and Adam, the officer inquired if Adam wished to press charges. Adam declined, stating that he just wanted to leave and promised never to bother our family again. Shortly thereafter, Adam's wife, Kate, arrived at the scene. My husband went out to greet her, and they engaged in a brief conversation. Adam rushed over to her, crying and apologizing, but she did not acknowledge him. The officer spoke with her, and I faintly heard her express her desire for Adam to stay away from her. The officer instructed Adam to step back, which he did, looking betrayed and breaking into ugly sobs. The officer had a conversation with Henry and Kate for a few minutes before entering the house to speak with me. He called up the stairs and requested that I come down for a discussion. I agreed but asked for a moment to get dressed. Subsequently, the officer took my statement. Towards the end of our conversation, he mentioned that my husband had requested my voluntary departure from the home. I conveyed to the officer that I didn't want to leave and that I needed to speak with my husband. He empathized but suggested it would be best if I did leave, at least for the night to allow things to settle down. I broke down in tears. He then inquired if there was someone I could call. I informed him that I could call my parents. Interestingly, shortly after mentioning this, I heard my mom's voice on the porch, talking to Henry. When I saw her expression, it crushed me. I simply said, "Mom, I'm sorry. Mom, I really messed up." The officer explained to my mom that it would be best for me to stay with her for a few days, at least until things calmed down. I then went upstairs to pack my things. While packing, my mom didn't say anything, but I could see that she was seething with anger. I knew she was furious, embarrassed, and incredibly disappointed in me. When we came downstairs and stepped outside, only the officer was there, along with several neighbors who were still on the sidewalk, engaged in conversation. The officer informed us that Henry had gone to pick up the kids from school. Henry would be taking them to practice and then out for a meal. He mentioned that Henry had requested that I lock up the house, and he would call me in a few days to talk. Upon returning to my parents' house, both my mom and dad reprimanded me for jeopardizing my marriage. I apologized and expressed my determination to regain Henry's trust. My dad, however, told me that it was unlikely to happen and that I should start preparing for a divorce. This brought me to tears, and my mom questioned why he would say such a thing. He simply responded, "Because it's true." Over the next 2 days, I attempted to reach out to Henry through texts and calls, but received no response. Then, on Wednesday evening, he sent a text proposing a meeting on Saturday morning at our home to discuss the next steps. He also mentioned that he had already informed our kids about what had transpired, which took me by surprise. I couldn't help but think they must now despise me. In a separate text, Henry revealed that he had pressed charges against Adam and obtained a 30-day temporary restraining order. I despised hearing this news, as I just wanted this nightmare to come to an end. To make matters worse, the incident was reported in the police section of our local newspaper. Although it didn't divulge names or our house number, it did disclose our street name and was written in a way that made it obvious what had occurred. Coupled with the local gossip, it seemed like everyone knew it was about our family. Saturday arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about meeting Henry again. My dad and mom drove me to our meeting point, but stayed on the porch as Henry and I met inside. I suggested they could leave, but Henry insisted on having them there because he didn't trust being alone with me. Can you believe it? When I approached him for a hug, he held up his hands to keep me at a distance. We sat down and he handed me separation papers. I couldn't hold back my tears and pleaded, "No, please don't do this." I continued to beg and expressed how deeply sorry I was and that I loved him, only him. He responded coldly with, "No, you don't," and began explaining the contents of the papers like a robot on a mission. Despite my continued pleas to have a conversation about what happened, he remained focused on detailing how the separation would work. He mentioned that I could move back in, but I'd be staying in the office, exactly as I left it. He then explained his plan to split our bank accounts evenly and divide the equity in the house if it were ever sold. However, he insisted that I relinquish any claim to his 401k. Furthermore, he outlined that starting the next month, I would be required to contribute 35% of our living expenses, including the mortgage, insurance, utilities, car payments, food, and more. This amounted to around $2,300 per month. Because I didn't have a job, I'd have to make payments to him using my share of the savings. He emphasized that all of these details were clearly outlined in the separation agreement and insisted that I should get a lawyer to review it. I expressed my reluctance to involve lawyers and told him I just wanted to have a conversation about us. He responded calmly but firmly, stating that there was nothing to discuss, and he simply wanted an official separation. He went on to explain that the only time he'd be willing to communicate with me would be for matters related to our children, or when our kids were involved in the conversation. He made it clear that anything else I had to say would be ignored. I couldn't hold back my tears as I asked him if he was seriously considering divorce. He responded, "Right now, that's my plan." I pleaded with him, telling him I couldn't imagine living without him, and that I would fight with all my strength to keep our marriage intact. His reaction caught me off guard, and I can still vividly remember it. He looked at me with utter disgust and burst into loud laughter. Then, he called my parents to come in, and he even dialed his parents on speakerphone to relay everything he had just told me to both sets of parents. It felt like a heartless business meeting, but for me, it was pure agony. All I could do was apologize to Henry and our parents, vowing to fight to save my husband and our family. This all unfolded earlier today, and now it's 2 a.m., and I find myself here in my office unable to sleep. During a conversation with my sister earlier, she offered valuable advice and suggested I share my story online to see if any readers might provide additional suggestions or guidance. So here I am seeking input. What steps should I take? Have I irreparably damaged my marriage? Is there any hope of salvaging the wonderful life I've shattered, or is it lost forever? I welcome all responses, even if they're critical. Right now, I feel like an outsider with no one to turn to. My sister has been supportive, although she's also deeply disappointed in me. Thank you in advance for taking the time to read this and for any responses you may provide. Since my last update, significant changes have occurred in my life. First and foremost, I want to express my gratitude to everyone who responded to my initial post. Reading all your comments provided me with some solace, even though many were understandably critical of my actions. From personal experience, I can attest that not all stories have a happy ending. In fact, some endings are quite painful. Henry and I are officially divorced now. Just typing those words brings tears to my eyes, and I'm still struggling to come to terms with it. It feels like a never-ending nightmare. As you may recall from my previous post, my husband and I were living together in the same house, despite our legal separation. During the first month, things remained cold between us, but then Henry gradually started to thaw, engaging in more conversations, laughing and joking with both me and the kids. I began to feel optimistic about our progress and believed reconciliation was possible, as long as we stayed on this path. However, out of the blue, about 4 months into our separation, Henry asked for a private conversation with me, without the kids present. I thought this discussion would center around our next steps toward reconciliation, but to my shock, he told me he wanted a divorce. It was an utterly devastating moment for me. I understand that many wives in similar situations use that term frequently in these posts, but I can genuinely say I was remorseful. Henry made it clear that while he will always have a deep care for me, as the mother of our 2 beautiful children, the love, passion, and trust we once had are no longer there. I made every effort to change his decision, but it was already firm. We embraced, but it felt more like the hug of friends rather than that of a husband and wife. Since we had been separated for almost 4 months and had already agreed on the division of assets and custody in the separation agreement, the divorce process proceeded swiftly and was finalized in February of this year. Henry treated me fairly. He bought out my share of equity in our home, and even gave me an additional $10,000 to ensure I could provide a stable home for our kids. Although I received a decent sum of money from the divorce, it wasn't enough to purchase a home or sustain me for the long term. Consequently, I took a job at a new donut franchise conveniently located near our kids' school. I knew the franchise owner, so I reached out to her and she hired me immediately. Contrary to what you might assume, I genuinely enjoy my job there. The owner is incredibly friendly and understanding, my colleagues are fantastic, and our customers are extremely pleasant. Sometimes I find myself wishing I had taken up a job while I was married, thinking that perhaps things might have turned out differently. You know how the saying goes, idle hands are the devil's workshop, or something along those lines. Well, I can't alter the past now. Now brace yourself for the next part. Regarding Henry, about a month after our divorce was finalized, he made an announcement to his family and friends that he and Kate were officially a couple. What's more, they were expecting a child due in August. I found out about this through my kids, who were excited about having 2 new siblings, the new baby and Kate's daughter. This news devastated me completely. I couldn't fathom how Henry could do this and not inform me himself. It's evident that Henry and Kate were involved with each other during our separation. Rumor has it they began their relationship shortly after D-Day. We live in a no-fault state, so it doesn't have much legal relevance anyway. In contrast to Henry and me, Kate opted for an immediate divorce from Adam. Since the house they were living in was a gift to her, and they apparently had limited savings, their divorce was finalized months before ours. As for Adam, his story is quite sorrowful. He was deeply affected by the divorce, and on Halloween of the previous year, he was arrested for driving under the influence, DUI. Apparently, this was his second such offense. Kate used this as a basis to obtain full custody of their daughter, and now Adam only has supervised visitation. These visits take place at Kate's parents' house because both Henry and Kate prefer not to see him. Furthermore, Adam is extremely fearful of Henry. I heard this through gossip, but it wasn't necessary. I vividly remember D-Day and how everything unfolded. I find it disheartening and unkind of Kate to put her child's father through this, even if she may harbor resentment towards him. However, I do understand why she took the actions she did. Currently, Kate and her daughter are residing in my house alongside Henry and my kids. Though it's technically no longer my house, I still can't help but think of it that way. This entire situation is incredibly distressing, and I try my best not to dwell on it, but it's on my mind nearly every minute of the day. I attempt to persuade myself that Henry's involvement with Kate is just a passing phase, similar to the one I experienced with Adam. Kate is attractive and young, she's 26, so she might seem like a new distraction for Henry. Given the stressful circumstances that brought them together, I have doubts about the authenticity of their love. Nonetheless, I hold on to hope that someday Henry and I might reunite. In the meantime, I wish him and Kate all the best. Last week, I received the news that my communication with Henry will be even more restricted. He informed me that starting this Wednesday, we will only discuss matters concerning our kids through email. Henry mentioned that Kate has been using this method to communicate with Adam, and he wants to do the same with me. Hearing this direct statement shattered me even further. I am certain Kate influenced him to make this decision, as he would never cut me off like this on his own. As for myself, I've been dedicating most of my recent time to decorating my new apartment and transforming it into a cozy space for my children. It only has 2 bedrooms, so things are a bit cramped, but we manage. I wish I could turn back the clock and alter the past, but that's impossible. So for now, I'm taking small steps forward, one at a time. That's where I stand today. Thank you for listening to my story.
All right, that was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned and let's dive in.
My husband, 40 years old, and I, 35 years old, always harbored a dream of escaping the hustle and bustle of city life, where we both grew up and lived. Our hearts were set on relocating to a charming countryside, much like the ones we'd read about or seen on TV. We spent time scouring property websites, searching for available farms, and setting a budget based on our preferred farm options. As a way to prepare for this change, We even began planting fruits and vegetables in our yard as a sort of practice for our future life as farmers. My husband dedicated himself to his corporate job, working hard to save up for the farm we had envisioned. Eventually, his efforts paid off, and we purchased a remote farm far from the city, situated on an isolated stretch of land. The nearest town was quite a distance away, and there were no neighbors in sight for miles. We cherished the serene atmosphere, the privacy, and the unhurried pace of life in this rural setting. Upon learning of our farm purchase and our plans to turn it into a family business, the locals and our nearest town's residents welcomed us warmly and offered their support. They not only assisted us with the hiring process for farmhand positions, but also generously shared their farming knowledge and expertise. This marked a significant shift from the every person for themselves mentality we were accustomed to in the city. This community truly embodied the spirit of mutual support, and I found the concept and experience immensely appealing. While my husband worked in the fields, I often found myself at home tending to our house and preparing meals. Additionally, we were actively trying to have a baby again, as I had been facing difficulties conceiving. Remarkably, the change in pace and environment seemed to be working, and things were looking up. It felt like pure bliss. However, over time, I began to feel increasingly bored and lonely due to our remote location. I suspect it's my city upbringing, as it's the only environment I've ever known, but I started yearning for the lively social life I had back in the city. I hadn't formed any substantial friendships here because the local women tended to be overly gossipy. The only person I could really connect with was one of our farmhands, who, like me, had moved here for a change of scenery after coming from the city. As we continued to converse, our bond grew stronger, eventually crossing a line from which there was no return. We engaged in passionate affairs on numerous occasions. What added to the allure was the element of risk and danger. It was exhilarating to avoid getting caught or arousing suspicion. This place was lacking excitement, and while I deeply loved my husband and our sex life was fulfilling, it was missing that thrill factor. This affair has been ongoing for approximately a year and a half, but I've made the decision to end things with the farmhand. Recently, I received the incredible news that I'm finally pregnant, which is a miracle given my past complications. My husband is thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father, and I'm also excited about becoming a mom. However, there's a nervousness about the paternity of the child. When I tried to break off the affair, he refused and revealed pictures and videos of me in compromising situations that I had no idea even existed. He threatened to expose everything to my husband unless I provided him with money. Initially, I complied and gave him the money he demanded. This continued until I ran out of resources. Even then, I borrowed money from friends and family to meet his demands. Now I find myself completely out of options. My husband has discovered the money lending and has questioned me about it, sensing that something is amiss. I'm in a state of panic and uncertainty, not knowing what to do next. Taking your advice, I decided to confess everything to my husband. His reaction has been filled with anger to the point where he can't even bear to look at me. When he does, it's with an expression of pure disgust. He has moved to the cottage near the stables and refuses to share the same house with me. I've pleaded with him on my knees, begging him to return to the main house, but he remains unmoved by my pleas. I held on to a glimmer of hope for our relationship when my husband fired the man who was blackmailing me and quietly assisted me in pursuing blackmail charges against that individual. However, my hopes were shattered when he questioned whether the baby was his. Honestly, I'm not certain myself. How can I mend this situation? I deeply love my husband, and I don't want to destroy everything we've built together because of a brief affair. How can I help him see reason? I made the decision to reach out to our friends from the city, individuals we knew and trusted completely, to stage an intervention. I felt desperate and couldn't continue living in that state. I had a sense that people were scrutinizing and judging me. I felt incredibly isolated, so I reached out to our genuine friends who had been with us through thick and thin. I invited them to our farm and shared what had transpired. They were understandably upset and pointed out that what I had done was a grave betrayal. Nevertheless, they supported me in my efforts to repair my marriage. Unfortunately, this did not sit well with my husband. In fact, it seemed to intensify his anger, and he demanded a divorce right then and there, embarrassing me in front of our friends. I acknowledge my wrongdoing, but now I'm genuinely trying to make amends. I just wish he would be a bit more willing to cooperate. He refuses to listen to anyone and is adamant about getting a divorce. He's been residing in the cottage and won't even glance in my direction. The other workers go out of their way to avoid me. Some of my friends have distanced themselves from me. I'm truly isolated and feeling incredibly lonely. I'm growing weary of trying to salvage this relationship, and I'm contemplating a return to the city. It's been nearly 2 years since my last update, and a lot has transpired. We are officially divorced now. It took a considerable amount of pleading and battling to reach this point, but we did. I gave birth to a baby girl, and even though her features strongly suggested she wasn't his, I still insisted on a DNA test. I was somewhat delusional and hopeful that the results would confirm she was my ex-husband's, in the hope that she could bring us back together. Following the DNA test, he created more issues for us. He refused to pay alimony and successfully filed a petition against paying child support, citing concerns about paternity. Unfortunately, he filed within the legal time frame to dispute paternity, and his petition was granted. He showed no interest in bonding with our child. Instead, he just wanted out as soon as he saw her. I had hoped that forming a connection with our child would encourage him to stay, but it didn't turn out that way. I eventually returned to the city and rented a 1-bedroom apartment for my daughter and me with the alimony awarded by the court. However, this financial support is ending in the coming months, and I'm uncertain how I'll manage once it's gone. I must admit I still miss my ex-husband and often daydream about what life would be like with him and our daughter. Please note, my daughter's biological father isn't in the picture. I have no intention of raising a child with a farmhand, as that would negatively affect my daughter's self-esteem. Third story. So, I'm at a loss for what to do, and it's been weighing heavily on my mind. In short, my wife developed a friendship with a coworker, which she claims is only an online friendship. They rarely interact at work, but as soon as they're home, they engage in extensive discussions about their workplace and share their favorite music. Initially, I didn't mind it much because my wife doesn't have many friends. However, she started texting him incessantly, even interrupting our dinner conversations and neglecting our ongoing online chats. I forgot to mention that she works a 9-5 job while I work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. I politely asked her to rejoin our ongoing conversations or spend time with the family on my days off or before I left for work. It was becoming increasingly frustrating for me, and I tried to communicate my feelings, but my concerns were dismissed. Fast forward to about 3 months ago, and my suspicions finally became overwhelming. I returned home, logged into her instant messaging (IM) account, and discovered that she had been engaging in sexually explicit conversations with this guy, even while I was at work, and, unbelievably, when I was at home. In these messages, she described the guy as incredibly attractive and expressed a desire for him. She even made a direct quote saying it was a shame she wasn't single because she'd tear him up. I was utterly devastated, sitting there trembling. This hit me hard, especially because we've been married for 9 years, together for 14, and we had always enjoyed a strong relationship. I confronted her about it, and she claimed she was just joking around, trying to boost her coworker's self-esteem. Apparently, he had recently gone through a tough breakup and was feeling down. I inquired about her happiness, and she assured me that she was content and wanted only me. We even decided to take a short vacation to a local bed and breakfast, and things appeared fine afterward. I expressed my desire for her to end her friendship with this man, and she agreed to stop. Fast forward to July 1st, the day before her birthday. I had purchased tickets for her to see one of her favorite bands in concert and was searching for a hiding spot to surprise her. To my surprise, I stumbled upon her phone concealed behind some clothing in the closet. Initially, I struggled with the temptation to check her phone, but I eventually gave in to that impulse. I discovered that she was exchanging messages with the guy again. While the messages weren't explicitly inappropriate, both of them seemed to yearn for each other. She also mentioned feeling compelled to spend time with me and our children. I haven't confronted her about this yet, and every day I'm away from home, I worry that things might be happening despite her assurances that nothing physical has occurred. I'm at a loss for what to do, and her betrayal has left me devastated. I have to admit, after returning home from overseas, I was in a rough place, and she was always there to support me. I must confess, during that time, I often turned to alcohol and was unpleasant to be around. I made a mistake and kissed another woman. It's the kind of situation that can lead to poor decisions. However, I truly believe that during her time as a military wife, she never cheated on me. In a way, I think she might have been feeling bored. She described it as an opportunity to boost her self-esteem. This guy, on the other hand, is what we call a Jody, and my suspicion is that she considers it a one-time occurrence. I'm planning to confront her today. I've arranged for my father to take the kids out for ice cream, and I'm looking for a hotel.